Thank you, Ian. Thank you to everyone who's worked to organize, especially the Gaia team, Liz and Ed. Thank you to Father Thomas Berry for all the inspiration he's provided all of us. And I would like to, of course, also remember Anita, such an intimate part of what is not a very large family in terms of the Earth community. The caring people, the people who would stop, reflect, do things differently, are not so huge in number. And I think we need to count our blessings that we've been put in a place where we can know each other, have as friends, and also when we lose friends, to know how precious they've been, especially Anita. I think before we think about transforming the economy, we need to think of how the economy has transformed us and the planet. And I'm sure this has been mentioned before, but economy was supposed to be the running of the household. It's derived from the same word, oikos, as gives us ecology. And yet, a few hundred years ago, a separation started. And I think that separation is linked both to the worldview that was created, which is why Thomas Berry's work is so important, because the worldview that has been imposed rigorously, including through those school education programs that were being discussed earlier, is the mechanistic worldview, totally inadequate to explain the world and the universe as it is, and totally inadequate when measured by science as it's evolved 100 years. And, I'm a quantum theorist, but all the explanation of what the world is the mechanical worldview of Descartes and Newton, carried to its ultimate extreme in terms of framing our minds in everyday life and going beyond the material world into social relations, which have always also been reduced to mechanical relations. But hand in hand with that worldview, of course, are the technologies that emerge from it. That worldview is needed because you need a divisiveness, and only thinking of the world as a machine allows us to divide it up. Reductionism is the epistemic divide and rule policy for nature. It allows man to keep chopping up, extracting, which is where then the technologies that we call technologies today have gained ground. They've basically been technologies of extraction of various kinds. Extractions from ecosystems, extractions from organisms, extraction from society, constant extraction. And that extraction is what turns that amazing power of maintaining life into a crippled power, generating huge amounts of waste. I mean, just look at a few things, a few examples of it. Look at the way we do fisheries today. Catch fish in the ocean, most of it is thrown back as bycatch, as they call it. Then you take that fish, much of it is then fed to other fish that are farmed in industrial farms, which generate only 10% of the protein that they are fed. And all this is supposed to be increasing productivity. Every step of creating more waste is defined as creating more production. And one reason I've kind of hung in there in the agriculture sphere is, trained as a scientist, I just could not tolerate the way the sums were not added up. Things were just dropped out. In food production, crop production, constantly told we needed those large factory farms, we need industrial farming, we need the chemicals. Every step of additional input of fossil fuels, every step of additional input of external inputs has been a step in declining biological production of the land. After all, productivity in agriculture should be how much do you get out of a piece of the land. And just as reductionism allows us to chop up, reductionism also allows the growth of what I have called the monoculture of the mind, which then allows us to count less as more and more as less. Let me just explain that a little bit. If you have a small biodiverse farm, which is the way farming is still done in most of the world, you will not just grow a commodity to sell to the marketplace. You will grow many kinds of food you need. No diet is made of only cereals. You will need a bit of protein. You will need a bit of oil. You will need a bit of greens. You will need vegetables. You will need fruits. You will need your fiber. You'll need your fuel. You'll need your fodder. You will need some timber to make your agricultural equipment, to put the poles to keep your hut up. An ordinary farm, especially in the tropics where we have the privilege of diversity, grows 250 species. And to manage 250 species, you have to be a gardener. And this is a point I know Satish makes very often. We grow crops like that on our farm in Dehradun in Vandana. And people will always come and say, oh, but how do you manage a field of 12 crops? I said, very simply, we don't have Caterpillar combine harvesters. You know, when you measure the farm with respect to a harvester, it's got to be a monoculture and it just goes in violence through the field. You're a human being. You're part of that beautiful earth community. You can collect this crop that's ready and leave that crop that's not. It's not such a difficult job. You do it in your garden. And yet the mindset of industrial agriculture has made us believe we cannot do with our farms what we do in the garden. So agriculture has ended up being a highly violent activity, and violent not just in terms of what it does to the earth, but also in terms of what it's doing to the people who are stewards of the earth, our farmers. We talk so much of extinction of species. For me, we will have crossed the tipping point as human society if we allow small peasant farmers to go extinct. They're our last bridge, they're our last cushion to turn around and live on the earth as an earth community. Because everyone else lives as a predator. They're the only ones who in the very production are also conservers. They can also be destroyers, because industrial agriculture has ended up being a destroyer. Destroyer of biodiversity, destroyer of the soil, destroyer of water, uses 10 times more water than good ecological agriculture, which is one reason we have such a huge water crisis, and now increasingly the destroyer of the atmosphere. The nitrogen fertilizers put into chemical agriculture pump out nitrogen oxides, 300 times more lethal as a greenhouse gas. And there's a wonderful, wonderful paper that Edward Goldsmith wrote and has been used also in the volume that the World Future Council has published, which has a lot of the data on greenhouse gases from industrial agriculture. Of course, the use of fossil fuels. And then when you globalize agriculture, you get into this crazy situation that no country, no society, no community is allowed to provide for their own food. Someone providing very high-cost food with capital-intensive systems manages to bring food to your doorstep that's cheaper. That's another part of the distortion of the sums and the arithmetic. I'm often asked, oh, but you know, how will we feed the world if we go organic? It's cheaper to produce food industrially. It's not cheaper to produce food industrially. It's very capital intensive to buy pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, micronutrients, irrigation water, energy to run those pumps, the debt, the credit. It is costly not just in terms of finance, it's costly in terms of human life. We in India, in the last decade of this push for industrial agriculture, have lost 150,000 of our peasants who've committed suicide. We probably lost 5 million who've had to leave the land. But 150,000 literally killed by a paradigm of agriculture that comes from a certain defining of the economy. And that defining of the economy is based on cheating, unfortunately. It cheats on the numbers in terms of production. It cheats on the prices. High-cost products end up being cheap. So we have the myth of cheap food. And it cheats on what's in the food. You know, part of the reason we have this huge disease epidemic is food has become a lie. We're being fed stuff that we weren't ever meant to eat. High fructose corn syrup, all those artificial fats. We were never meant to eat palm oil. And we weren't meant to eat soya oil either. No culture, no society has ever eaten this stuff. And now, of course, that they've fed us these industrial oils, they found there's a better market for all of this in running cars. So agriculture is going to go through a series of new twists with industrial biofuel demands on the land. The climate crisis is very directly a result of going deep into the earth and taking fossilized fuel that should never have been touched if we functioned as an earth community. It was not part of any living being's food, diet, waste. It just didn't fit anywhere in anyone's cycle. It's pumped out, and that it was pulled out as coal and as oil is one part of the problem. But I think the deeper part of the problem is how it redefined our humanity. I've just been at a very important meeting in the Arctic on the melting of ice, and the team of scientists who were with us were showing all the graphs that the polar ice cap will have melted in 20 years, not by by a century down the line, but in 20 years we could have an ice-free Arctic. In that meeting was some eminent people, and I won't take names because it saddens me in terms of what they said, and their eminence and this perception don't go together. And part of the debate started about how nuclear is a solution, a clean solution. And everyone was saying, no, it's not. And this eminent person says, no, we have to have more energy. We have to avoid work. We have to avoid the use of our muscles. And he said it so passionately. He said it as the definition of our humanity is to give up work. And of course, then you go for a workout. That's different. But work as work, not allowed. Paying a health club and a gym, allowed. Working the land, not allowed. Cleaning your floors, not allowed. And this one perception has become the source of violence against the third world in ways you cannot imagine. Currently, the two big things we are fighting are the takeover of peasant land by the globalizing economy. And it's the same processes that took over the commons here a few centuries ago, but this industrial economy has a limitless appetite, and then you add with it economic growth, which has even more limitless appetite, just has to constantly get to newer and newer places to absorb them and transform them into waste. Every software company needs fancy offices, needs luxury housing for its employees who are being paid. I can tell you, Britishers are paid twice their British salary to move to India right now. And the same for the Americans. And so there's a whole relocation, all related to cost savings. You pay one person twice, and you shed the remaining. And then you hire the rest at 1/8 the salary. And you get the resources for free. A new law has been created called Special Economic Zones, based on the old colonial law of 1894 and the contemporary globalization. Now, the interesting thing with this, it's just last year it started. And immediately, the peasants started to rise. All we did was bring them all together into one movement, because there was Nandigram, and there was Singur, and there was Dadri, and there was Raigarh. People were organizing themselves. I'm giving this detail, A, to show that the economy as it exists is hurting the poor most. And then that hurt is turned into a liberation. The debate in India has been in recent months, oh, we've got to get the farmers off the land. They shouldn't be working. It's a curse to be working. We've got to get them into the slums. We've got to get them into the cities. But on the land, that's primitive. Yeah. That whole thing of we've got to liberate ourselves from muscles. We've got to liberate ourselves from our human body. We've got to escape from our from our species being. Another big assault, of course, this invention of the recent decades, the supermarket chains. They want to come to India. 100 million people buy and sell things in India. Every street is a market. If those of you who've been there, you'll know. To me, that's what makes India. That's what makes incredible India. It makes for our freedom. It makes for our productivity. And of course, now the Walmarts want to be there. The Tesco's want to sign up. No, it would be crazy for them to compete with someone who can bring you vegetables to your doorstep. Why on earth would someone drive 20 miles out to a horrible box, give up all the color of our markets and the diversity of the markets, where either the market comes to you or you can walk down to the market? So they have to then use laws to shut down domestic markets. So not only do you have a worldview, instruments of technology, you have instruments of law to prop up a particular kind of organizing the economy. It doesn't happen naturally. It's made to look like it's happening naturally. That there's an evolution. That supermarkets just take over, Supermarkets become the way we want to shop. There's huge coercion behind it. Again, on this too, it happens through law, but it also happens through a cultural projection. Just like it's made to look like a peasant shouldn't be working on the land, it's made to look like that pushcart seller, which to me is the highest form of not damaging the environment. No fossil fuel use. You go to the big mandi in the morning, get your vegetables, distribute them by the evening, haven't contaminated anything, haven't polluted anything. So in our world of today, with this instant media brief, where every newspaper has the same style of story. The Time, the Newsweek, the Indian papers, all of them. And the tone of all of them, and this is a quotation from One India Today, our leading English weekly, they said, when we go to an Indian marketplace, it's 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. And now with the new supermarkets coming, it's 99% inspiration and 1% perspiration. So I wrote a reply to this article, which of course they didn't publish, because once it's planted, they don't publish a reply. And I said, you've forgotten the perspiration of the planet. This is 99% perspiration. Billions and billions of additional energy generation just to get the goods moving long distance, refrigeration, cold chains, energy demands that weren't necessary if the energy and power was the energy and power that Thomas Berry is talking about in these statements of his. And of course, if we don't go to that deeper level, we will always be offered solutions for everything that's wrong that will make the problem worse at the next step. In the case of agriculture, once we came to know chemical agriculture is wrong, what was offered as the solution? Herbicide-resistant crops that can take more chemicals. Bt toxin crops. Climate change, everyone knows, serious problem. What's being offered as a solution? The issue of converting our land into producing fuel for cars, industrial biofuels, carbon trading, which is, in terms of wild law, a very important piece to be looking at, because in effect, what carbon pollution did was privatize the atmosphere, which is a global commons. So some people put too much, more than their share. And now those same people manage to get property rights to the atmospheric commons. That's what emissions trading is about. That's what the European solution is about. That's what the Kyoto implementation has ended up becoming. And I want to read this out to you. It's even the Stern review. Brilliant analysis. Brilliant all the way in terms of what's wrong and what are the costs. But when it comes to the solution, the main solution is emissions trading and using market instruments. And Nicholas Stern clearly states in his review that emissions trading is the allocation of a full set of property rights. Property rights to the atmosphere. When I started working with farmers to save seeds, and I would explain to them the concept of patenting, of turning property, turning life itself into property, which then prevents a farmer from saving seed, which then helps you generate technologies that will generate sterile seed. And we dealt with privatization of water. The Ganges was being privatized. 2 years ago, we stopped the World Bank in that project for Delhi. Now, the company that did all that was PricewaterhouseCoopers. It was the consulting company. When I talk about water, I talk about seeds. Ordinary peasants would turn around and say, next they will privatize air. This is what PricewaterhouseCoopers says about trade in carbon dioxide. Trade in CO2 emissions is equated with the transfer of similar rights such as copyrights, patents, licensing rights, and commercial and industrial trademarks. And of course, besides the fact that there's property rights, there's money to be made once these property rights are signed. And they're talking about the carbon market becoming, it's already at 30 billion, and that it would grow to 1 trillion. And look at the language that has started to appear in financial dailies. Carbon will be the world's biggest commodity market, and it could become the world's biggest market overall. Pollution will become the biggest market overall. And those who've polluted will be rewarded. The polluter will get paid, contrary to the environmental ethics of the polluter should pay. Shell has called carbon a new alien currency. And that's where we have to turn our minds, that the currency of life is life itself. And maintaining that currency is what the Earth Community obligation is about. That's our real work. We will not be able to separate these false currencies if we continue to do work at one level and say that the governments can look after. Because we handed them the climate change agreement, we handed them Kyoto, and they've given us $1 trillion market for Shell and BP, and big energy companies. And of course, there are other false solutions, like nuclear. We are in the midst of an intense debate over this new US-India nuclear policy agreement, which is supposed to be about clean energy. It's a clean energy agreement, solution to climate change. Tucked away in it, 15 times Iran is mentioned. It's a license to war. In the name of solving the climate crisis, the most important independent, non-aligned country, the land of Gandhi, the land of Ahimsa, is being mobilized for wars without end over oil. And this, the economy organized in the structure that it is, will do this. It will hijack decision-making. Corporations will become the decision makers. And while we sit together and think of how to do things differently, they're already thinking 30 years ahead and saying, this will be a concern, this is how we will pretend to respond to public concern, and this is how we will protect our privileges. So unless we start to see, besides the fact that we have to see ourselves in the continuum that Thomas Berry is talking about, the continuum of life, we have to also address ourselves to the continuum of power and not separate ourselves from creating structures of transformation in terms of economy, decision-making, and our worldviews. And I think it was today in one of the interventions it was mentioned that the reason we have to feel part of the earth community is that's the biggest sense of power we can experience. Yeah? And given $1 trillion in carbon trading, $1 trillion in patenting seed, $1 trillion in privatizing water, about 20 trillion in commodifying food, you add it all up, that's huge financial power. Yeah? But the only force, the only mobilizing force to respond to that is that energy that Thomas Berry's statements talked about. He talked of power, the power of the universe, the power in us. In India, we talk about it very simply as Shakti. And nature, Prakriti, is just an expression of that power in all diversity. We start to then recognize different organizing principles for economy. The industrial economy that's at war with nature and at war with people is based on the paradigm of monoculture. It's based on a paradigm of uniformity, standardization. And talking of standardization, here is one more area where law is mobilized to destroy freedom for species as well as for people. Food safety laws, to me, are the strangest bit of laws in today's world. Yeah? If an old lady brings to a hospital some cake she has baked in her home, that's dangerous, that'll kill you. Factory farms that generate resistant viruses and super virulent diseases, they're safe. GMOs are safe. But a cucumber that went slightly crooked, dangerous, can kill you. They're actually trying to introduce those kind of laws in India. A big fight we are having over this, where there's a 5 lakh, which is 500,000 rupee fine for a company selling food that kills somebody. And there's a 500,000 rupee fine for a farmer that brings a non-standardized product to the market. And of course, you can just see the links between standardization of products, backward linkages, uniformity of seed, seed monopoly. And I want to say we managed to mobilize so quickly on the retail democracy, on the food freedom, that we've managed in the last 2-3 weeks to get these policies reversed in 3 states. And the 2 main instruments we have right now to replace monocultures with diversity to replace external control, because the corporate control comes out of external control. Corporate profits are based on external control. Anything a system can do for itself, it must be prevented from doing it so that an external purchase can be made. And that's where the markets grow. External input systems, transforming self-organized living systems into systems dependent on external inputs and systems dependent on selling. In fact, the very measurement of GNP and GDP is based on the assumption that you buy what you consume and you sell what you produce. If you consume what you produce, it doesn't count in the economy. So all of nature's self-organizing production of life doesn't count. All of household economy doesn't count, which is why women's work doesn't count. All of third world production does not count. When it's destroyed and we make cheap vegetables in Africa and India for Sainsbury and Tesco, that's the day economic growth takes place. When families are feeding themselves, there's no economic growth. So self-organization, quite clearly, is a key part of Earth community. And to see in self-organization production, which means a huge shift in terms of how we perceive where growth takes place and what happens. Now, of course, to have these paradigms is one thing. Bringing them to reality in the context of the architecture of a violent economy is what we are being called to do. We are not doing this in a vacuum. So if the laws are designed for monopoly and destruction and non-sustainability, if the technology is designed for that, and if the worldview is designed for that, of course we need a change in worldview. How do you do the other two things? How do you deal with monopoly and how do you deal with technology? And that's where Gandhi gave us amazing instruments. Instruments we have mobilized in India again and again and again, beginning with the seed. When the patent laws were introduced, we said it's wrong, just like Gandhi said it's wrong to monopolize salt by the British. We will continue to make our salt. We said it's wrong to monopolize seed. Farmers will continue to save seed. We will have a seed satyagraha. Right now, I'm having with Rajinder Singh, one of our very important water activists, we're having a Yamuna satyagraha because they want to build a games village, a helipad, a Formula One racing track inside. Okay. It's 100 years celebration of Gandhi first having mobilized satyagraha, which is the force of truth. Satya is truth. Agraha is the compulsion, the force of truth. To act from truth, which means to act against unjust law. And the first time it was done was on September the 11th, 1907. South Africa, when racial discrimination was being introduced into law and everyone had to carry identity badges. And Gandhi and the Indian community said, we will not be divided. We are all citizens. We will not wear these identity badges. We will not cooperate with an unjust law. And in his little book called Hind Swaraj, whose 100 years will be next year, he wrote, there is no superstition as strong as the superstition that unjust law must be obeyed. A higher moral duty to higher law requires that as society we disobey unjust law. Now, if there's a higher Gaian law and a higher universe law that's being violated systemically by the economy, it is our duty and our obligation, working from a higher law, articulating that higher law to say, for these reasons, I will continue to save seeds. I will continue to defend the freedom of our rivers. I will continue to defend the freedom of the air and the atmosphere and not turn that also into a commodified system. But to be able to do that, you need the sense of being part of Earth community. And in being part of Earth community, you already create alternatives. You can either buy your fertilizer, or as part of Earth Community, you know the earthworms do the work with you. You know your compost does the work with you. You know the humus does the work with you. Earth Community becomes the alternative. And that is the second key inspiration from Gandhi, where he made self-organization the ultimate definition of freedom. Swaraj, self-rule. Now, it was reduced to the term home rule, which basically meant the viceroy leaves all the structures of domination behind. People with brown skin fill in those same spots. But everything stays designed for exploitation, designed for domination. And for Swaraj, Gandhi also made the connection that I think is so important in our times. He is among the very few actors and thinkers in our period, in our age, who did not define freedom in an empty way only politically. He recognized that you can't have political freedom if you don't have economic freedom. If your everyday life of what you eat and how you clothe yourself and what's the state of your housing and how you move around, if over none of that you have control, if none of that you can influence, then where are you politically free? So he connected freedom, Swaraj, to Swadeshi, the ability to design your life, which again comes back to that ultimate power of life, the power of life as a self-organizing force. And if you were to ask me, what's the biggest challenge we have in terms of responding to climate change, which is quite clearly the most serious environmental crisis, it is basically to recognize that we have the capacity to design our lives. And we have an obligation to design our lives with the larger design of the universe. And the two must match. Reclaiming our capacity and merging that capacity with a higher order. If we do it in time, there's a chance our species survives. If we don't, we will be extinct like so much else in life has gone extinct. The universe will carry on. Gaia will carry on. The sad thing is, it's the poor who will pay the first price. They are being pushed to extinction today. And I believe what works against the poor works against the planet. This illusion we've been given that let the rich become super rich and let them create more and more poverty, and their richness will someday miraculously erase the poverty they created. We have to get away from that, because the killing of Indian peasants and the destruction of the atmosphere are the same act. Before the atmosphere is polluted, a person is killed on the land. And we have to reconnect not just our life to the continuity of the Earth community. We have to reconnect the issue of justice for the last person with the sustainability of our future. Thank you.